So with the trial for the new Clash game mode coming to an end, I wanted to talk about pacing in Overwatch as a whole. And before I dig into what I'm sort of focusing on in Overwatch, I wanted to sort of provide a very basic definition for what pacing is, just to make sure we're all on the same page and that we can sort of properly apply it to Overwatch. So pacing, it's the general order and rhythm of activities and events in a level. Obviously not a perfect definition for Overwatch since it's a PvP thing and the word level doesn't quite fit neatly. But regardless, pacing, Overwatch. Let's talk about the Overwatch 2 game modes. We have Push, Flashpoint, and now we have Clash. In Overwatch 1, which carried over to Overwatch 2, we had Escort, Hybrid, and 2 Capture Point, which I'll be referring to as 2CP. In Overwatch 1, it was pretty consistent in terms of pacing with their game modes, aside from 2CP. I think a lot of people, myself included, and you'll see this a lot in sort of discourse online regarding this game mode. A lot of people will look back at it fondly with a bit of nostalgia, but to be honest, some of the maps made for that game mode felt very stagnant at times, which I would argue really fucked with the pacing. I think specifically of Hanamura and Anubis. Those are the two big ones. Volskaya was bad, but it was different. Trust me, if you weren't there, if you were there, you know what I mean. It was different. Anyways, that little spiel over. In Overwatch 2, the pacing seems to have changed a bit in comparison to Overwatch 1. And of course, a lot of that's due to the character reworks, balance changes, the shift from 6v6 to 5v5. But I think the new game modes have a lot to do with it as well. So now focusing on these game modes in Overwatch 2, we start with Push, which is notorious, I feel like, for the long walks to the objective from your spawn, especially if your team has pushed the robot very far. Even with the forward spawn system that they have in place, it can still be a hike, and I feel like that downtime between, going from spawn to the objective, which has varying times depending on where the robot is on the map in relation to where you are spawning and all that stuff, all those intricacies, it fucks with the pacing a little bit. It makes it feel like you aren't involved all the time, and that the time that you can expect between engaging with enemies, it just feels off. And I think that, that offness sort of just contributes to this varying pacing, and at least in this game mode compared to other game modes. Speaking of other game modes, the other one to mention is Flashpoint, and I can obviously say a lot less about this just because it's so apparent at this point about how Flashpoint works in terms of pacing, especially compared to every other game mode that we've seen so far. Flashpoint, man, fuck, dude, you think about it like that. I can think of the 100+ meter walks that I have from after losing or winning an objective and moving to the next point, the downtime for your team to go from the objective you captured to the point, for the enemy team to go from their spawn to the point. It's just the downtime in between that is long, and it just doesn't feel great. The pacing is very slow, like I said before, especially in comparison to other game modes, and that just, it doesn't feel great. That's all I can really say about it. And having had those rather negative opinions about Push and Flashpoint, that's where we're sort of left with Clash. Clash is obviously a lot more fast-paced, easily. It's not even comparable, to be honest. The size of the maps is obviously very different. The spacing of objectives and spawns relative to those objectives is also very different. I know the immediate walk from, you say you just spawn in from point to objective is super short. It's the shortest I think I've seen it in almost any game mode, to be honest. It feels very good for me anyways. That brings me to the next point. How do I enjoy it? I love this game mode. I love the constant uptime. I love the constant engagements and interactions. Like I said, I've been playing Overwatch forever, so I've obviously fallen in love somewhat with the gameplay loop. And when I get to play a game mode like Clash, where it is pushing the engagements between players to make it more and more frequent, I'm obviously going to love that. Now, having said that, I understand that it's not enjoyable for everybody. I think I was on like an Overwatch Anonymous Twitter post that was talking about how good the Clash game mode was, and somebody beneath it was like, well, it's not for me. And I asked them why, and they were like, well, I don't enjoy the constant uptime, which it's an interesting perspective to have. And if you have this perspective and you feel like talking about it, please do it in the comments. I'd love to sort of get a better understanding as to why people don't enjoy this constant uptime. But for me, I definitely do. And speaking of uptime, that's where you introduce the pacing. The pacing is obviously very fast-paced, and I think it's unlike anything that we've seen before in Overwatch 2, especially in comparison to the other new game modes that they've added, talking about Push and Flashpoint. So having said all of this about the different game modes and the different pacing, it sort of begs the question, does Overwatch have a pacing problem? And I think it's a difficult question to answer because relative to how Overwatch is exploring different game modes, I feel like it's almost too soon to tell. We know that with Push and Flashpoint, maybe if it's even unintentionally, they've explored slowing down the game and trying to make players value survivability and sustaining themselves and staying alive long enough to, and they've used the long walks from spawn to the points to sort of reinforce that dying is very, very, very bad, especially more bad in these game modes compared to other game modes where the walk to re-engage is shorter. With Clash, like I said, they're exploring the opposite almost, where it's like you can die. It'll cost your team, surely, but this will give you the opportunity to quickly re-engage. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but like it'll really give you a chance to flip the fight, sort of. Like I've gone down big in a lot of these matches. Obviously, I've gotten rolled in plenty of Overwatch matches, but specifically in this game mode, I've been down. I've been one point away from losing, and I've been able with my team to flip it and completely reverse sweep, or maybe just slightly edge out a win or something if it's a close game. It's possible in a game mode like this where the pacing allows for a good team to do good, but it also gives maybe the worst team a chance to fight back, and I don't know, it gives the losing team a chance, and it does so without the game feeling unnecessarily unfair, which is dope for the pacing. It's dope for everything. So like I said, does Overwatch have a pacing problem? I think it's too soon to tell. I think the core game modes that they took from Overwatch 1 to Overwatch 2 are good enough to provide some sort of good solid basis for what the pacing should be like. Overwatch has experimented with these slower pacing game modes like Push and Flashpoint. They're now experimenting with faster paced game modes like Clash, and I'm curious to see what the future will be, and I think that'll really determine what Overwatch is in terms of pacing and whether their pacing will be a problem in the future.